She was 32 years old, bleeding out on a delivery table, and her husband was in the hallway texting his mistress. She never made it home. But 4 days later, his girlfriend was changing the sheets on her bed. 2 weeks later, she moved into the house. And then came the social media post, a photo of her baby shoes, captioned, "Sometimes life gives you a second chance at family." They thought they had erased her completely. They were wrong, because hidden behind a stack of baby blankets in the nursery closet was a sealed envelope, a USB drive, and a letter that began with 6 words. "Mom, if you are reading this." What that dying mother had quietly prepared while painting name plaques and singing to her unborn babies was so precise, so devastating, that when a judge read the results aloud in open court, every person in that room went silent. The mistress, the mother-in-law, the lawyers, all of them realizing in that single moment how badly they had underestimated a dead woman. The story will remind you. The quietest people are often building the most powerful plans. And a mother's love doesn't end, not even at death. If you've ever been underestimated, stay with me. This one is for you. Drop A in the comments if you believe justice always finds its way, and subscribe so you never miss a story like this one.
The key to her victory lay hidden in the nursery closet, tucked behind a stack of baby blankets. It was a sealed envelope, a small USB drive, and a letter that began with 6 chilling words. "Mom, if you are reading this." When her mother finally found it, it set in motion a plan more brilliant and heartbreaking than anyone could have imagined. Dr. Nina Prescott, the physician who had fought to save her, remembered her final, whispered words, not a plea for her own life, but a message for her children, a desperate testament from a mother who already knew she was leaving them behind. It was a clue to the incredible foresight of a woman who, even in her final moments, was thinking steps ahead. But what drove her mother to look in that closet? It began with the girlfriend changing the sheets on the dead woman's bed just 4 days after her death. It escalated when, less than 2 weeks later, she moved into the house. The final insult was a social media post, a picture of the dead woman's baby shoes, captioned with the words, "Sometimes life gives you a second chance at family." She genuinely thought she had won. Meanwhile, Dr. Prescott, who had delivered over 2,000 babies, was haunted by the loss, the first mother she had ever lost. The relentless screaming of the monitors in that delivery room was a sound that would never leave her memory, a constant reminder of the life that slipped away while a new one began. The mother's suspicion was born in the sterile quiet of the hospital hallway on the night she died. Grant Ashford, her husband, wasn't pacing or praying. He stood against the wall, his face lit by the glow of his phone, thumbs moving efficiently. A nurse, her face streaked with tears, approached him. She said his name. He didn't look up. She said it again. He just held up a single finger, the universal sign for wait. Only on the 3rd try did he finally lock his phone, slide it into his pocket, and follow her, his walk unhurried, his expression unconcerned. In the NICU, 3 isolatids held 3 tiny, perfect babies. Margot in pink, Bridget in yellow, and Theodore in blue. They were small but stable, fighters just like their mother. Grant looked them over and asked the nurse if all 3 were healthy. When she nodded, he simply said, "Good." He didn't ask about his wife, Colleen, not until Dr. Prescott stood before him and spoke the words directly. Even then, his reaction was strangely measured. He closed his eyes, pinched the bridge of his nose, and exhaled like a man processing a minor business loss. "Was it the hemorrhage?" he asked, his tone analytical, not heartbroken. After hearing the details, placental abruption, uncontrollable bleeding, he nodded, ran a hand through his hair, and confirmed the babies were stable. "I need to make some calls," he said, turning back to the hallway. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number in 3 seconds, a number he clearly knew by heart. "It's me," he said into the phone. "She's gone. Come to the hospital, but wait until the morning. I'll text you when." After hanging up, he took a long moment, straightened his collar, and walked back into the NICU, the mask of the grieving husband firmly in place. Dorothy Brennan, Colleen's mother, arrived at 11:23 that night after a 4-hour drive through a blinding rainstorm, her mind repeating a single prayer. At 61, she was a woman who had survived everything life could throw at her, and she was ready to be a grandmother. But when she walked into the maternity ward, she was met not by her son-in-law, but by a hospital chaplain. She knew instantly. A mother always knows. The word no was all she could manage before the world dissolved into the rush of blood in her ears. She didn't hear the chaplain's gentle, practiced words. She simply sat down on the cold tile floor of the corridor and let out a sound older than language itself, the sound of a heart shattering. Grant eventually appeared, kneeling beside her with a steady, practiced voice. "I'm so sorry, Dot. She fought so hard." As Dorothy looked up at her son-in-law, something cold and sharp, a warning, pierced through her grief. Later, in the warmth of the NICU, as she touched each of her tiny grandchildren, she saw it. Margot had Colleen's nose. The baby's tiny fingers curled around her own, and in that simple, reflexive gesture, Dorothy felt a message from her daughter. "I'm still here, Mom." She was looking at Margot, then Bridget, then Theodore, 3 perfect babies born into a world their mother had just been forced to leave. 32 years old, Colleen Ashford died on the delivery table as her 3 children screamed their first breaths. So that's how it was. Her death wasn't an end. It was the trigger for a plan she had prepared all along. The judge's voice cut through the stillness. Full custody. Dorothy drew the triplets closer, their warmth of final, solid truth, across the courtroom. Grant's composure shattered. The woman beside him, with her defiant red lips, looked utterly defeated. It was finished. The quiet, profound weight of justice settled over them. A promise made to her daughter, finally honored. This victory, however, was born from a single, chilling sight. A betrayal witnessed through a hospital window in the dead of night, just hours after her daughter's last breath. A crushed paper cup had been the only witness to the beginning of her silent war. Everything had hinged on Colleen's letter. Its words, read aloud by Dorothy's lawyer, methodically dismantled Grant's facade. "If anything happens to me," it read, "know that Grant and his mistress planned it. He doesn't want these babies. He wants the insurance payout." It was a voice from the grave, a mother's last fierce act of protection. The letter laid bare the calculated cruelty, the carefully orchestrated accidents, and the cold ambition that had cost Colleen her life. With every sentence, Grant's performance as the heartbroken widower unraveled, exposing the truth he'd tried to bury. But finding that message had been a desperate gamble, sparked by a whispered warning. That hushed warning had pushed her to act. She'd slipped back into the house long after midnight, a phantom in her own daughter's home. The nursery was quiet, filled with the scent of innocence and deceit. Just as she'd been told, behind a pile of neatly folded baby blankets in the closet, her fingers brushed against an envelope. Her name was written on the front in Colleen's familiar script. Her breath caught in her throat. This was the reason for her daughter's cryptic phone call weeks ago, a terrifying secret she'd entrusted to a friend before it was too late. It was Colleen's best friend, Jolene, who had delivered the message. Amid the stifling condolences and casserole dishes at the reception, She had pulled Dorothy aside, her eyes swollen and urgent. "Colleen told me if anything happened," she'd whispered, "to check the nursery closet, behind the blankets." As Jolene spoke, Dorothy felt the cold, calculating gaze of Grant's mother from across the room. Laurel Ashford watched her not with sympathy, but with the predatory stillness of someone guarding a secret. It was then Dorothy knew she was in a fight, and that she had to play her cards perfectly. Her first move had been a strategic retreat. Grant had confronted her a few days after the funeral, his smile thin and brittle. "Your presence is disruptive, Dorothy. It's confusing for the nanny, for the schedule." He'd spun it as concern for the children, a need to establish his own routine. Dorothy saw it for the eviction it was. "Of course, you're right," she'd said, her voice calm, hiding the fury beneath. "I'll pack my things." She left that afternoon, not in defeat, but to give her lawyer, Emmett, the space he needed to begin building their case from the shadows. In the days leading up to her departure, she became a silent observer, a chronicler of damning details. A strange woman's voice on the baby monitor late one night whispering, "Soon this will all be ours." A sympathy card left carelessly on the counter, not with the others, signed simply, "To my love, V." She documented everything in the small leather notebook Colleen had given her, the immediate call to the life insurance company, the swift donation of all her daughter's belongings, the hiring of a nanny who was Vivian's old college roommate. Each entry was a brick in the wall of evidence she was building against him. His performance at the funeral had been flawless. Standing at the podium in his sharp suit, Grant wept for the light of his life, his voice breaking perfectly on cue. The crowd of 300 mourners wept with him, but Dorothy sat in the front row, her back rigid, her gaze fixed on the casket her daughter was sealed inside. She watched him lie. In the last pew, Vivian Holloway, in a tasteful black dress and lipstick the color of blood, watched him with an unnerving look of pride, as if admiring her investment. Beside Dorothy, her son Fletch was a statue of silent rage, his jaw clenched so tight it looked like it might crack. She wasn't imagining things. She knew it the moment she saw them. 4 hours after her daughter was pronounced dead, Dorothy had stood at the hospital window, looking down at the parking garage. There was Grant, not grieving alone, but with a woman whose dark hair and red lipstick stood out against the concrete gloom. The woman's head rested on his shoulder as she held his hand. He made no move to pull away. He just stood there, accepting her comfort. The paper cup in Dorothy's hand slowly collapsed, cold water dripping unnoticed over her fingers as she watched the man who was supposed to be heartbroken. With the garage drain washed clean, Dorothy stepped back into the house, a faint smile playing on her lips. She gave the nanny a warm look, placed a soft kiss on each of her grandbabies' foreheads, and even praised Grant for a breakfast he hadn't made. That night, with the home silent and Grant locked away in his study, she slipped into the nursery. Kneeling by the closet, she shifted a stack of baby blankets aside. Just as Jolene had told her, a manila envelope was taped to the back wall. On the front, in her daughter's hand, were 2 simple words: "For Mom." Holding it to her chest, Dorothy took a deep breath. She wouldn't open it here, not in this house of secrets, where the man down the hall was already texting the woman who left red lipstick marks and funeral guest books. She tucked the envelope in her jacket, fixed the blankets, and left the room, determined to read it somewhere safe, somewhere Grant Ashford would never find. Under the solitary glow of a streetlight in the Maple Street Library parking lot, Dorothy turned off the car and locked the doors. The sealed envelope on the passenger seat felt impossibly heavy, weighted with her daughter's final words. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside, she found 5 things: a handwritten letter, 8 pages long, in Colleen's perfectly neat paralegal script, a small black USB drive taped to an index card that read, "Everything is on here. Dates, recordings, financial records. Give to Emmett." A copy of a phone bill for a separate account in Grant's name, showing hundreds of calls and texts to a single number, sometimes 20 times a day, and printed screenshots of text messages between Grant and a woman named Vivian, messages that went back 2 years. There were loving messages, messages making plans, messages about a shared future that had no room for Colleen. Finally, a small folded note read, "Mom, if you're reading this, I was right. Don't let him take my babies. The drive has everything." Dorothy read the note 3 times before setting it down and picking up the letter. In the dim light, Colleen's voice emerged from the pages, not paranoid or hormonal, but the clear, rational voice of a woman who had meticulously pieced together the truth. "Mom," it began, "I know how this looks. Grant says I'm a paranoid pregnant woman, but I'm not. I found the texts. I saw the photos. He has been with her for 2 years, the entire time we were trying for these babies, the entire time I was enduring fertility clinics and shattered hopes." Dorothy's hands shook as she held the letter against the steering wheel to keep reading. "I found a hotel receipt from 5 months into my pregnancy." It was in his coat pocket, the letter continued, for a room at the Winslow Hotel, charged to his personal card. The receipt listed rose petals and champagne for 2. I was at home, so sick I could barely stand, eating saltines while he was drinking champagne in a hotel with her. When I confronted him, he said I was hormonal, that the pregnancy was making me irrational, that I needed to see a therapist. He wanted me to believe I was the problem. Page after page detailed Colleen's discoveries, a hidden second phone, credit card bills for dinners, and jewelry she never saw, another woman's earring in his car. She described hiring a private investigator with her own savings, who confirmed Grant's affair with Vivian Holloway, a 29-year-old real estate agent he'd been seeing for at least 2 years. But the words that stole Dorothy's breath were near the end. "Mom, I'm not writing this because I think I'm going to die. I'm writing this because Grant has been asking about my life insurance policy 3 times in the last 2 weeks. He wanted to know the value, the payout terms, and if there were exclusions for childbirth complications. Then, last Thursday, he casually asked Dr. Prescott if complications were common in triplet deliveries, like he was just checking off a box." Dorothy lowered the letter, her own breath fogging the windshield, her heart pounding in her temples. She picked it up one last time. "I changed my will 3 weeks ago with Emmett's help. If anything happens, the house goes to you, and the savings go into a trust for the babies. Grant gets nothing. A man who asks about his pregnant wife's life insurance doesn't deserve her. He doesn't deserve her children or her memory. I hope you never have to read this. I hope I come home with 3 healthy babies and we can burn this envelope and laugh. But if the worst happens, you have everything you need. Fight for them, Mom. Fight like you always do. You're the strongest person I know, the only one I trust. I love you. Now, go be their grandmother. Your Collie." Dorothy folded the letter, pressing it to her chest. The distant sound of a train horn echoed in the empty lot. She didn't cry. Grief had turned into something harder, something with a purpose. She looked at the evidence her daughter, the meticulous paralegal, had assembled. Colleen knew how to build a case. Even while terrified and carrying 3 children, she had prepared for war, organizing the evidence with color-coded tabs and a table of contents. Dorothy started the car and drove straight to Emmett Calloway's house. It was past 10 at night, but she didn't call. She simply stood on his porch, holding the manila envelope that held her daughter's last act of courage. Emmett, Colleen's 45-year-old godfather, with salt and pepper hair and calm eyes, opened the door. He was the one who had taught her to ride a bike, given her a first job at his law firm, and helped her secretly change her will. He saw Dorothy, saw the envelope, and let her in without a word. They sat at his kitchen table until 2 in the morning, reviewing every piece of evidence. A text from Grant to Vivian, sent 4 months before the delivery, made Emmett pause. Once the babies are born and things settle, it read, "We will be free. She'll sign whatever I put in front of her. She always does." Emmett looked up, his voice quiet. He was planning this. Before she even delivered, he was planning to take everything. Dorothy nodded. She already knew. "What do we do?" she asked. Emmett closed the laptop. His godchild, a bright, meticulous woman he'd known her whole life, was gone. "We do exactly what Colleen wanted," he said. "We fight." And it all started just 2 weeks after the funeral, over a breakfast of scrambled eggs and toast. Grant, using the very pitcher Colleen had bought on a sunny October day in Vermont, poured orange juice and spoke in a gentle, practiced voice. "Dot," he said, "I think it might be best if you head home now. The babies need a stable routine, and your presence has become a bit disruptive." Dorothy just set down her fork. "I'm not losing my mind," Dorothy had whispered to Fletch in the church. The scent of white lilies thick in the air. The muscles in his jaw worked furiously. He didn't answer immediately. He just stared at Grant at the altar, before finally turning to her, his voice low and rough. "Your sister called me 6 weeks ago, crying," he said, his hands tightening into fists on his knees. She hung up before she could tell me what was wrong. It was a perfect, calculated strike, delivered not in a courtroom, but through a cascade of whispers and forwarded messages. For 48 hours, Vivian tasted what she thought was victory. She was the one lying, she told Grant, his mother, anyone who would listen. The babies aren't even his. She nearly blasted the news online, convinced this was the proof she needed, that Colleen was unfaithful, that Grant was the true victim. But then came the countermove from Emmett's office. The clinic records, the donor consent form, the medical files, showing Grant's non-viable samples. Suddenly, the narrative shattered. The timeline proved Colleen hadn't had an affair. She had made a brave reproductive choice, a secret she kept to protect the family she was so desperate to build. And just like that, Grant's case for custody evaporated. How could a man with no biological tie, a documented history of financial fraud, and a blatant extramarital affair possibly stand against the children's biological grandmother? Vivian's triumph curdled into humiliation. The news of the DNA results had hit Grant's legal team with the force of an earthquake. But for Dorothy, it was simply confirmation of a truth she had just learned. She had asked Emmett why Colleen never told her husband, and his answer came from a journal entry he'd found. He read her daughter's words over the phone, a voice from the past explaining it all. The doctor had said Grant's samples were unusable and recommended a donor. "I said yes," Colleen wrote. "I didn't tell Grant because he would have refused. He would have said his pride matters more than our family, and I want these babies more than I want his approval." The words settled in Dorothy's soul, recasting the entire landscape of her daughter's marriage. This wasn't an affair. It was a solitary medical decision, an act of profound courage from a woman married to a man too proud to accept help, too selfish to put his family before his ego. He was now fighting for children who weren't his, for insurance money he didn't deserve, all to erase the woman who had built her family without him. That devastating journal entry, however, was only found after Emmett's team had uncovered the financial rot at the heart of the marriage. The morning after the confrontation at the doctor's office, He had called with terrible news. Grant had already filed a claim on Colleen's $750,000 life insurance policy, a policy that had been mysteriously increased from $200,000 just 6 months prior. The signature for the increase, Emmett confirmed after a handwriting analysis, was a forgery. Dorothy's blood ran cold. But there was more. A forensic accountant digging through a USB drive Colleen had left behind discovered a separate LLC grant had opened 18 months ago. Over a year, he had siphoned $320,000 from their joint account into it, using small, untraceable increments. The money had bought a 2-bedroom condo downtown, with the title neatly placed in Vivian's name. He had also been making monthly payments of $4,000 to Vivian, disguised as consulting fees. The final blow from Emmett's report was the most personal. The $85,000 Colleen had inherited from her father had been moved into that same secret LLC 6 months ago, with no record of her consent. Staring at her own reflection in the hotel mirror, Dorothy saw a 61-year-old woman, her face a map of laughter and loss. She was exhausted, but exhaustion was not defeat. "File everything," she commanded Emmett, her voice steady. "Whatever it takes. I want custody of those babies, and I want Grant Ashford to answer for every single dollar he stole from my daughter." This resolve fueled her, days later, at the Triplets' 1-month checkup. She arrived early, with the babies in the triple stroller, its shipping tag still attached, a relic of her daughter's hopeful preparations. She was at the reception desk, the legal emergency contact, when Vivian swept in, all red lipstick and designer diaper bag, announcing herself to the receptionist with a practiced smile. "I'm here for the Ashford triplets. I'm their stepmother." The waiting room fell silent. Every other mother looked up. The receptionist's eyes darted between the two women. Dorothy didn't shout. She simply reached into the stroller and lifted baby Margot into her arms, feeling the tiny, warm weight settle against her chest. "I have the appointment," Dorothy stated calmly. "These are my grandchildren, and this woman is not their stepmother." Vivian's smile flickered. "Grant sent me," she insisted. "Grant is not here," Dorothy replied, turning her back and carrying Margot toward the exam room, the nurse following with the other 2 babies. Vivian was left standing alone at the counter, holding bottles for babies who no longer needed them. That afternoon, Dorothy drove to the cemetery. The air was cool as she walked across the damp grass to Colleen's simple gray headstone. She sat on the ground, not caring as the moisture soaked through her clothes. She cleared away a small weed and brushed the dirt from the engraved letters. Colleen Marie Ashford, beloved mother, daughter, friend. The words were true but incomplete. They left out warrior. Her daughter had been a warrior, secretly building a fortress of evidence. Manila envelopes, USB drives, dated photos, because her husband had convinced her that speaking out meant she was crazy. As the groundskeeper began his evening rounds, Dorothy stood and touched the top of the cold stone. "I found the envelope, Collie," she whispered. "I found everything, and I'm not going to stop." It was that discovery, just days after the funeral, that had ignited her fight. Jolene, Colleen's best friend, had called one evening, her voice tight with rage. "Dot, you need to see Vivian's latest social media post." Dorothy's stomach plummeted as she opened the app. The photo showed a pair of tiny, hand-stitched baby shoes with yellow daisies arranged on a marble countertop. She recognized them instantly. Colleen had bought them when she was 8 months pregnant, waddling through a boutique, holding them up with a radiant smile. Now, Vivian had claimed them as her own, with a caption that read, "Sometimes, life gives you a second chance at family." Dorothy closed the phone, her hands pressed flat against her knees, breathing in and out, counting down to a detonation only she could feel. And that detonation was made possible by the fortress Colleen had left behind. That night, Dorothy drove back to her hotel, the sky painted in the sunset colors her daughter had loved, the very colors she'd chosen for the nursery. After a quiet meal, she sat on the bed and opened a small notebook. She documented the incident at the doctor's office, recording Vivian's exact words, the time, the witnesses. She then placed the notebook on the nightstand right next to the letter she'd found in the envelope. 2 documents, one from a mother, one from a daughter, building the same case, protecting the same 3 lives. It was this evidence that gave them a fighting chance against Grant's lawyer, a man with a name that reeked of old money, Bradford Whitfield III. In the end, it was the DNA test that broke them. The judge's voice was calm, but each word landed like a hammer blow. Theodore was Grant's son. Margot and Bridget were not. In the stunned silence of courtroom 412, Grant Whitfield's meticulously constructed world fell apart. His lawyer, a man who charged $500 an hour to sound confident, could only stare at his notes. Laurel Ashford, the woman of pearls and perfect posture, finally looked small. The restraining order was dismissed with prejudice. Dorothy was granted temporary custody of her granddaughters, pending a full hearing, and the district attorney's office was being formally notified of significant financial irregularities and potential fraud. Justice didn't arrive with a thunderclap, but with the quiet unfolding of a terrible truth. But that victory was earned in 21 agonizing days. It began with a counter-petition, a brilliant legal maneuver by Emmett. He didn't just ask for grandparent visitation. He demanded a guardian ad litem, an independent voice for the children, cutting through the noise of grieving parents and grandparents. He argued that bringing an unrelated woman into the home so soon after his wife's death showed questionable judgment. He pointed to financial records that hinted at a deeper deception. Most importantly, he leveraged Colleen's own fears for her children's safety. When Dorothy hesitated, her world still spinning from the shock, Emmett's voice was firm, a lighthouse in her storm. "Do it," she had whispered into the phone. The city traffic outside her hotel window, a hum of a life she no longer recognized. It was the first step back from the edge. The foundation for that counter-petition was built on paper and pain. For 3 weeks, Dorothy's hotel room became a war room. Patricia, an accountant who saw poetry and numbers, laid out Grant's financial betrayal like a battlefield map. The shell company, the condo purchased for Vivian, the money siphoned off and disguised as fake fees. He built a castle on a foundation of lies. Patricia had said, her bifocals sliding down her nose. Jolene, Colleen Nine's best friend, provided the human cost, her deposition painting a heartbreaking portrait of a woman fading away, a voice shrinking to a whisper under the weight of her husband's control. "I should have pushed," Jolene had wept, a regret that hung heavy in the sterile conference room. "I will carry that forever." And through it all, Fletch was there. He appeared from Portland, her brother, his toolbox, and his quiet, simmering fury a strange comfort. He didn't make promises he couldn't keep. He simply set up, in the room next door, a silent guardian. "I'm not leaving until this is over," he'd stated, and that was that. While Fletch stood watch, Dorothy walked, miles to nowhere on a hotel treadmill, one foot in front of the other, the only way she knew to keep moving. Each step was a small act of defiance, a refusal to collapse. The rhythm of her walking was a counterpoint to the frantic beating of her own heart, a steady measure against the chaos that threatened to consume her. The nights were for Colleen. Emmett had recovered her pregnancy journal, a spiral notebook with a lavender cover, from the house. In her own elegant script, Colleen had chronicled her journey. It started with pure joy, the sound of 3 tiny heartbeats, the sweet burden of morning sickness. She wrote of picking names, of feeling them kick for the first time. But then, a shadow fell across the pages. A change in tone, subtle at first, then sharp as a shard of glass. Grant was distant, leaving during an ultrasound after a hushed phone call. He was no longer crying tears of joy. The entries became a catalog of heartbreak, a single gold earring found under a car seat, the scent of a perfume that wasn't hers, the hushed way he'd say baby into his phone, a term of endearment he no longer used for his wife. Then came the investigator, paid for in cash, and the confirmation, Vivian Holloway. A 2-year affair that likely began before the IVF, before the promise of a family. Dorothy's hand trembled as she read her daughter's words, feeling the deep impressions of the pen, the physical weight of a betrayal born in silence. But the final entry, written just 6 days before she died, was not one of defeat. It was a declaration of war. "I'm not staying because I'm weak," Colleen wrote. "I'm staying because I'm getting ready." While she decorated a nursery, she was also building a case. While she picked out blankets, she was hiding manila envelopes filled with evidence. She was a mother protecting her unborn children and a woman preparing her escape, fighting a silent battle no one knew she was waging. The journal, a letter, and a notebook, 3 pieces of her daughter's hidden life, sat stacked on the hotel nightstand, a testament to a strength Dorothy had never fully understood. She lay in the dark of the hotel room, the hum of the air conditioner, a lonely sound. She saw her daughter's face, not the careful, quiet woman of the last few years, but the loud, laughing girl who danced in the kitchen and talked to strangers in the supermarket. That girl had been slowly erased by a man who convinced her that her own intuition was a form of madness. "You were right, Collie," Dorothy whispered to the empty room. "I'm so sorry I didn't see it." She didn't sleep that night, but she gathered her strength, piece by piece, for the fight that was to come in a small, fluorescent-lit courtroom on the 3rd floor. And so it all began in a hotel room that smelled of minibar whiskey and sorrow. It began with a legal document that sought to paint a grieving mother as a monster. The restraining order claimed Dorothy was emotionally unstable, aggressive, and a disruptive influence. Attached was a statement from Laurel Ashford, who described Dorothy as hysterical and unable to respect boundaries, a woman who created a scene at a pediatrician's office. Reading the petition in his office, Emmett had called her immediately. "They're trying to isolate you," he had said, his voice grim. "It's a standard tactic. They want to control the narrative, make you look crazy." And in that moment, in the sterile quiet of a hotel room, a broken-hearted Dorothy had asked the question that changed everything. What do we do? With every word, the courtroom's atmosphere shifted, pulling taut 300 invisible threads connecting every person in the room. Finally, the judge turned to Dorothy, asking for her response to Grant's accusations. Dorothy rose. Her gaze swept from the judge to Grant to Laurel. She took a breath to speak, but her voice caught on the first syllable. She paused, centered herself, and began again. "Your Honor, my daughter is gone," she said, her voice clear now. "She left behind 3 infants who will never know her voice, never feel her arms around them, never hear her sing the same lullaby I once sang to her." The courtroom was utterly still. Not a cough, not a rustle of paper. The man sworn to protect her, she continued, moved his mistress into their home before the funeral flowers had even wilted. He forged my daughter's name to cash in her life insurance. He took the money she inherited. He took down her photos from the walls of her own home. And he has the audacity to stand here and call me overbearing. Her voice was now a low, steady force, the voice of a woman who had moved past trembling. I am not here because I'm overbearing. I'm not here because I refuse to let go. I am here because my daughter asked me to be. She locked eyes with the judge. She left me a letter. She left me evidence. She left me a promise, and I will keep it. The judge observed Dorothy for a long, quiet moment, then glanced at Grant, and then at the thick evidence binders Emmett had submitted. She ordered the DNA test. She approved temporary, supervised visitation for Dorothy until the full hearing. She denied the restraining order. A single muscle and Grant's jaw clenched. A tiny, furious motion, but Dorothy saw it. She met his glare and held it. Outside, Fletch was a bundle of nervous energy, pacing back and forth. As a character witness, he'd been sequestered and wasn't allowed inside. He vibrated with an intensity that could either erupt into brilliance or disaster. When Grant emerged from a side door, Fletch saw him and moved before anyone could react. "You killed my sister," Fletch said, his voice low and controlled, far more chilling than a shout. "Maybe not with your own hands. But you shattered her heart so completely her body just gave out. You took her money, you took her peace, you took her trust, and now you're trying to take her children." Grant paused, looking down at Fletch. He meticulously adjusted his cuffs and straightened his collar, the small actions of a man who saw himself as above the fray. "Your sister was unwell, Fletcher," he said, his tone calm, almost kind, almost believable. "Mentally, the pregnancy only worsened it. Everything I did was to keep my family safe. I'm truly sorry you're unable to see that." Fletch's hands were shaking. Dorothy grabbed his arm, her grip firm, a mother's hold that communicated not here, not now. "I need you to hold on for just a little longer." Fletch took a step back, exhaling slowly. He fixed his eyes on Grant one last time. "Colleen saw you," he stated. "She saw right through every lie, every excuse, every single smile. She saw you for what you are, and she made damn sure the rest of the world would see it too." Grant offered no reply. He walked to his car, slid behind the wheel, and sat there for a long time without starting the engine. Later that night, Dorothy found herself alone in her hotel room, sitting on the cold bathroom floor. Her legs had simply buckled. She'd slid down the wall, clutching Colleen's letter to her chest. "I don't know if I can do this, Collie," she whispered to the empty room. "I'm 61 years old. I'm up against a man with unlimited money, a team of lawyers, and a mother who will lie on the stand. I just don't know if I have the strength." The bathroom was stark. White tile and a single, unforgiving overhead light. Dorothy caught her reflection in the mirror opposite her. She saw herself, but she also saw something more. Her eyes, they were Colleen's eyes. The same shade of green, the same gentle tilt at the corners. It was as if her daughter was looking back at her. Pressing her palm flat against the cool tile, Dorothy pushed herself to her feet. She faced her reflection, splashed water on her face, and dried it with a rough hotel towel. She walked to the nightstand, picked up the phone, and called the front desk. She requested more towels. It wasn't that she needed them. She just needed to break the silence in the room, a silence that felt chillingly similar to the one that followed the doctor's words. "I'm sorry, we did everything we could." The clerk was young and cheerful, promising to send the towels right up and asking if there was anything else she needed. She said no, thank you, and good night. After hanging up, she sat on the bed and opened a notebook. She recorded the date, what had happened in court, what the judge had ruled, what Grant had said, and what Fletch had said. Then, She put on her coat and drove to a 24-hour diner on Route 9. The place was warm, a welcoming mix of coffee, bacon, and the constant hum of the fryer. A waitress with tired eyes and a gentle smile came to her table. "Apple pie," Dorothy said, "and a black coffee." She chose a booth by the window, watching the waitress move between tables, refilling mugs for truck drivers and night shift nurses. She saw a young couple happily sharing a plate of pancakes at 2 in the morning. She savored every bite of the pie, the apple, the cinnamon, the flaky crust. It had been Colleen's favorite, a slice they would share every Sunday after church. On a $6 check, Dorothy left a $40 tip. She drove back to the hotel with the windows rolled down, the biting air making her face sting and her eyes water. She didn't touch the heat, letting the cold shock her awake, a stark reminder that she was alive, that she was still in the fight, that she was still here. It had been 6 weeks since that first court date, and the DNA results could arrive any day. Emmett had walked Dorothy through every possible outcome, explaining the science and the timeline. He'd urged her to be patient, but Dorothy wasn't patient. She was stubborn, determined, exhausted, and heartbroken, but never patient. The phone call came on a Tuesday afternoon. Dorothy was in her hotel room, folding laundry she'd done in the guest machines. Tiny clothes for the babies, outfits she'd been collecting during her visits. She carefully folded each small item: 3 little shirts, 3 pairs of socks, 3 tiny hats. Her entire world was now measured in threes. Her phone buzzed, and Emmett's name appeared. "Dorothy," he began, "I'm going to need you to sit down." She perched on the edge of the bed. A small white sock with a yellow duck on it slipped from her lap and fell to the floor. "The DNA results are in," Emmett said. Dorothy held her breath. She could hear Emmett's breathing, the tick of a clock on his desk. Everything and nothing at once. "The triplets," Emmett said, pausing to clear his throat. "Margot, Bridget, and Theodore. Not a single one of them is Grant's biological child." The world seemed to tilt, not a physical shift, but something deep inside Dorothy rearranged itself, as if the floor had moved an inch. The walls had breathed out. The very air had changed. "What did you just say?" she asked. "I said none of them are his. Not one, not two, all 3. The court-ordered paternity test is conclusive. Grant Ashford is not the biological father of those children." Dorothy pressed her free hand into the mattress, feeling the texture of the hotel cotton. It was real, solid. She was still in this room, still in this life that relentlessly pulled the rug out from under her. "How is that even possible?" she whispered. Emmett began to explain, his voice slow and careful. "The way you deliver news that changes everything." Colleen and Grant had been undergoing IVF treatments for 3 years at the Whitfield Fertility Clinic. While Grant had been told his sperm count was low, he believed it was still viable. After 3 implantation attempts failed, with Grant's samples repeatedly flagged as non-viable, the clinic had recommended donor material as a standard backup. The consent form for using anonymous donor sperm was signed by Colleen, and Colleen alone. Grant never signed it. He was never even told. The clinic's records showed only her signature on the donor agreement. She knew, Dorothy said, the word's a statement, not a question. She knew, Emmett confirmed. The clinic advised her, after the second failed round, that Grant's samples were unable to produce a viable embryo. They suggested a donor, she consented, and she never told him. Dorothy fell silent, her mind racing. She looked down at the tiny baby sock on the floor. Ah, so that's how it was. Her daughter had been fighting this war long before she had. Her daughter hadn't just left her a promise. She had left her the ammunition. At the hospital, Grant's lawyer had painted a picture of Dorothy showing up unannounced, refusing to leave, and causing a mortifying scene at the pediatrician's office. Every claim was technically accurate, but twisted into a weapon. That was the art of it, the kind of subtle distortion that money could buy. Not outright lies, but a truth bent so far it pointed in the opposite direction. Emmett had waited patiently, letting every word hang in the courtroom air. Then he rose. "Your Honor," he said, "I have evidence proving Mr. Ashford's account isn't just a tossed incomplete. It's a calculated deception." He then presented the financial trail: the LLC, the transferred money, the condo in Vivian's name, the forged signature on the insurance, the monthly payments, the stolen inheritance. As Whitfield's objections were repeatedly overruled, Emmett brought out the text messages from the USB drive, reading 3 aloud, one about being free after the babies came, another about Colleen signing any document he gave her, and a final damning text from Vivian to Grant, sent just 2 days after the funeral. "When do I get to stop being the secret? I've waited long enough." It all began long before, with a quiet, agonizing secret. Colleen's fortress of evidence existed for one reason. She knew Grant's character. She knew that in the days after her death, a woman named Vivian would appear, not in the main house at first, but in the guest cottage, where Colleen had organized her files, printed her screenshots, and written that final, damning letter. Within weeks of the funeral, Vivian moved with calculated speed, redecorating the home, firing the nanny, and systematically removing every photograph of Colleen from the walls and tables. She replaced them with cold, impersonal art, erasing the woman whose life she was stealing. She told everyone she was a close family friend, helping a grieving man, that the babies needed a mother figure. She never mentioned that she had been sleeping with their father for 3 years. Vivian transformed Colleen's home office into her own space, with new curtains and fresh flowers on the desk where Colleen's laptop used to be. She presented herself as a savior to the neighbors and the nanny, a pillar of support in a time of tragedy. Her swift, relentless takeover was a campaign to replace a memory. But what she didn't know, what Grant didn't know, was that Colleen's most powerful secret wasn't about an affair or stolen money. It was about the very existence of her children. And in a small, unassuming manila envelope, hidden in a place only her mother would find, Colleen had left behind the one truth that would ensure her children were protected. Her memory was honored, and that the life she had fought so hard to create would never truly be erased. In the end, the story wasn't about Colleen's betrayal of Grant, but his of her. She hadn't cheated. She had built a family in defiance of him. For 8 months, she carried 3 children through a difficult pregnancy, painting their nameplates and drawing hearts on ultrasound pictures. All the while, she knew the man sleeping next to her was with someone else. Grant wasn't crushed by remorse. He was leveled by public shame. His name, his legacy, none of it was in those babies. His mother, Laurel, made that clear in a single, icy phone call. "Those children are not our problem," she said, before hanging up for good. The cruel irony was lost on no one. For 3 years, Grant had been unfaithful to the one person actually building their family, enduring the shots, the appointments, the painful work, all on her own. She did it all knowing her husband's role in their family had ended at the bedroom door. The key to her plan, the reason her mother now had the children, came from a quiet phone call. Dr. Nina Prescott had contacted Dorothy, her voice heavy with a secret she'd held for too long. "Mrs. Brennan," she began, "your daughter told me something the week before she delivered, something I can't shake." Dorothy held her breath. She said, "If anything happens, make sure my mother gets the babies, not Grant." The doctor had dismissed it then, promising everything would be fine. I was wrong, Dr. Prescott admitted, but I remember her words, and I'll repeat them in court if I have to. In that moment, Dorothy heard her daughter's voice again, strong, clear, and brave. She thanked the doctor and hung up the phone. Sitting in the dark of her hotel room, she didn't need a light. Everything was suddenly crystal clear. Grant had made his move first, going to a Channel 7 reporter who specialized in tear-jerking stories. In his own living room, stripped of Colleen's pictures, he put on the performance of a lifetime. He wore a casual shirt, no tie, looking like an honest man, with a terrible secret to share. I loved my wife, he said, his eyes perfectly moist for the camera's close-up. I believed we were building a family. Finding out the truth has destroyed me. When asked about his affair, he masterfully deflected. I made mistakes, yes, but I never stopped loving Colleen, and I never stopped believing I was the father of those babies that was stolen from me. The story ran on the 6 o'clock news and again at 10, then exploded online. Within 48 hours, public opinion was split, but Grant had misjudged his audience. He could manipulate a courtroom or a dinner party, but the internet was a different beast. People had questions. If he loved her so much, why did his girlfriend move in just 2 weeks after the funeral? Why was he already filing for life insurance? And how did he forge his dead wife's signature so quickly? After 3 days of letting the questions fester, Emmett, with Dorothy's go-ahead, released the truth. He provided the forged insurance papers, the handwriting analysis to prove it, and the bank statements showing $320,000 funneled to an LLC that bought Vivian's condo. The affair, it turned out, predated the IVF treatments entirely. He'd been with Vivian all along. The final nail in the coffin was a single text message, now part of the public court record. Grant to Vivian, 4 months before Colleen died. Once the babies are here and things calm down, we'll be free. She'll sign anything I ask her to. She always does. Public opinion didn't just shift. It crashed like a tidal wave. Women everywhere shared the story, recognizing the familiar pattern of lies and gaslighting. Colleen was no longer a victim. She was a hero who had outplayed her husband from the grave, building a legal fortress while decorating a nursery. That's when Vivian Holloway called Emmett. His phone rang late on a Thursday from a blocked number. "Mr. Calloway," a woman's voice said, "this is Vivian. We need to talk." She arrived at his office the next morning, looking exhausted and stripped of all pretense. She laid it all out. Grant was already texting another woman, a pharma rep named Danielle, just 2 weeks after Colleen's death. While Vivian was moving her things into his house, believing she'd secured her future, he was already starting over again. "I found the messages on his phone," Vivian said, "just like Colleen found mine. It's history repeating itself, only I'm not pregnant and I'm not dead." She then handed Emmett the recordings of their recent conversations, giving him everything he needed. The final piece clicked into place when Vivian explained Grant's plan. Emmett stopped writing, leaning back as the full picture emerged. Grant had told her to be the mother his kids needed, Vivian confessed. It wasn't about love for them or a desire to be a father. It was about the image. "He needs me in the frame for the case," she said, her voice hollow. He was using her just as he'd used Colleen, a prop to craft the perfect public facade. Emmett studied her, his gaze intense. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. Tears welled in Vivian's eyes as she glanced at the ring on her hand, the one a private investigator had photographed. "I'm not a good person in this story," she admitted. "I knew he was married. I told myself she didn't appreciate him, the usual lies, but I had no idea about the insurance. She didn't know he'd forged the signature or that he was draining Colleen's finances while she carried children he claimed were his. With a final, decisive movement, she slid the ring from her finger and set it on the desk. I thought he loved me. I was wrong about that too. Emmett picked up the ring, examined it, then placed it down. Will you testify? He asked. Yes, she replied without hesitation. Under oath, in court, whatever you need. That afternoon, Emmett called Dorothy, who listened in silence from her hotel room as he relayed Vivian's defection. After a long pause, Dorothy's voice was firm. I don't forgive her, she stated. She slept with my daughter's husband. She moved into my daughter's home. I don't forgive that. Understood, Emmett said. But, Dorothy added, if her testimony can protect those babies, then I will accept it. Colleen was practical. She would have used every weapon available. That weekend, for the first time, Dorothy took the triplets to the park. She pushed the triple stroller that had arrived 6 days after the funeral, the paper shipping tag, with Colleen's name still attached to the handle. For 2 hours, she walked through the park, past the playground and the pond, past the very bench where she and a young Colleen used to feed ducks. She didn't think about Grant or the court case, not the DNA tests or the forged signatures. The book said they were too young to laugh, but then she heard it. A tiny, bright burst of sound, like joy caught by surprise. In all that time, she never once checked her phone. The final hearing was that Monday, back in room 412. The air felt different, charged and heavy like it does before a storm. Dorothy wore the same navy dress Colleen had chosen, her hand touching the monogrammed purse that held her daughter's letter, a private ritual. Grant showed up alone, his expensive lawyer, replaced by someone younger and less sure. His mother, Laurel, was gone, having vanished after the family name was dragged through headlines filled with words like fraud and affair. Emmett laid out the case with devastating, methodical precision. The financial crimes, the forged signature on the LLC, the stolen inheritance. Each document was presented like a surgeon's tool. The case was built just as Colleen would have built it, color-coded, organized, and completely airtight. The DNA results proved Grant wasn't the father, and the donor form was signed only by Colleen. Then Vivian took the stand. Calmly and clearly, she described the affair, the texts, and Grant's cold-blooded planning. He didn't love me, she told the court. He didn't love Colleen. He loves the story of himself, the surgeon with the beautiful family. We were all just characters. Grant's lawyer tried a brief, useless cross-examination against the mountain of evidence. Dr. Nina Prescott testified next, repeating Colleen's last wish. If something goes wrong, make sure my mother gets the babies. Jolene spoke of her friends' fading laughter and missed book club meetings. Finally, the guardian ad litem delivered her report after 4 weeks of observation. Her recommendation was unequivocal. Custody should go to the maternal grandmother, Dorothy Brennan. She cited Mrs. Brennan's consistent, loving care against Mr. Ashford's pattern of deception and financial misconduct. The judge deliberated for 2 hours. Dorothy sat on a hallway bench, clutching her purse, her breath catching in her chest. Fletch paced endlessly, his boots a steady rhythm of anxiety on the tile floor. Jolene simply sat beside her, holding her hand, offering a silence that said everything. With the judge's words, it was finally over. Full legal and physical custody is awarded to Dorothy Ann Brennan. Dorothy felt her heart hammering as she shut her eyes, not with a gasp or a tear, but in quiet acceptance, letting the verdict settle over her. The judge continued, ordering Grant Ashford to repay every dollar he had taken from their accounts and his late wife's inheritance. His forged life insurance claim was now a matter for the district attorney. Grant just sat there, frozen, as his lawyer whispered frantically. He gave a single, tiny shake of his head, the final, defeated gesture of a man with no moves left. Mr. Ashford's medical license is placed under review, the judge declared, adding that his mother, Laurel Ashford, was denied any visitation rights. Looking directly at Dorothy, the judge's voice softened. Mrs. Brannan, your daughter left behind a remarkable record. This court recognizes the extraordinary measures Colleen Ashford took to protect her children, and we are honored to fulfill her wishes. Dorothy opened her eyes and gave a single nod. Thank you, Your Honor, she managed, her voice steady. Later, outside the courtroom, Emmett pressed a small white envelope into her hand. Colleen gave this to me 3 weeks before the delivery, he explained. She said to give it to you only after everything was settled. She said you'd need it then. The envelope was light, just a few pages, yet it felt impossibly heavy. She didn't open it at the courthouse or in the quiet of her car. Instead, she drove to the cemetery and sat on a bench near Colleen's headstone. It was a warm afternoon, with early spring daffodils piercing the soil by the fence, a flower Colleen had always loved. They were proof, she'd said, that beauty could survive the cold. Dorothy finally opened the envelope. Dear Mom, it began, if you're reading this, 2 things are true. The babies are safe, and you won for them. I should have told you everything sooner, about Grant, the affair, the money, the IVF. I was so ashamed, not of using a donor, but of staying with a man who made me feel it was something to hide. These babies are mine. Every cell, every heartbeat, every 3 a.m. kick. I chose them. I grew them. I tell them about you every night, Mom. About your world-famous apple pie, how you cry during commercials, and how you will love them fiercely, just like you loved me. I'm not scared of dying. I am scared of them growing up under Grant's influence. That's why I created the paper trail. It's why I met with Emmett. It's why I changed my will. I know you'll be tired, Mom. 3 babies at 61 is a lot. But I've seen your strength. You raised Fletcher and me alone after Dad passed, working 2 jobs and never missing a single school play. You're the strongest person I know. Tell them about me, but only the good parts. That I loved to garden, watched terrible reality TV, and could never parallel park to save my life. Tell them I wanted them more than anything. I love you, Mom. Now go be their grandmother, their mother, their entire world, your collie. Dorothy folded the letter back along its perfect creases, a habit of the precise paralegal her daughter had always been, even in a final goodbye. She tucked it into her purse, beside the first letter, her wallet, and a small notebook. It would stay with her always, not as a reminder, but as the closest thing she had to holding her daughter's hand. She rose, splashed her face at the cemetery's water fountain, and wiped it dry on her sleeve. Her reflection showed green eyes, Colleen's eyes. Returning to the headstone, she stood as a breeze whispered through the trees, and a cardinal sang, a flash of red on a gray branch. You saved them, Collie, Dorothy whispered. From your own grave you saved your children. She rested a hand on the sun-warmed stone for a moment before walking back to her car. Fletch was there. Jolene was there. The triplets were in the back with their new nanny, Helen, a kind 53-year-old woman recommended by Emmett's wife. Margot had already fallen asleep on her shoulder. Dorothy got in, buckled her belt, and glanced in the rearview mirror at 3 car seats, 3 tiny faces. Margot was now awake, her green eyes meeting Dorothy's. For the first time in months, a genuine smile spread across Dorothy's face. It wasn't a brave front or a performance. It was real. She started the car and pulled away from the curb, past the daffodils blooming stubbornly along the fence. A vibrant yellow, promising life. That promise had been fulfilled over the last 6 months. The house on Birchwood Lane was different now, changed not by renovation, but by the gradual way a garden transforms with the seasons. Dorothy had repainted the master bedroom a soft yellow, the color of daffodils and the sunrise that filled the nursery at 6:15 each morning. She kept Colleen's furniture, but gave the walls a fresh start. She put all of Colleen's photos back up and added new ones. The triplets at 1 month, 2 months, 3 months. Their timeline of life growing right alongside the pictures. There was Bridget's first smile, Margot's first tooth, and Teddy reaching for a spoon with the focus of a tiny conqueror. Colleen's garden had also been brought back to life. Dorothy, no expert, learned by reading her daughter's gardening journal, another notebook, filled with careful script about soil and sunlight. The rosemary had survived the winter. She saw it as a sign. This new life was made possible because Grant had pleaded guilty to insurance fraud. A plea deal left him with 3 years of probation, a hefty fine, and a permanent stain on his record. His practice was shuttered, his partners voted him out, and his hospital privileges were revoked. His name now only appeared in court filings. Laurel Ashford cut him off completely, not out of sympathy for Colleen, but out of shame for the family name. Reputation for Laurel was as vital as breathing, and her son had turned their name into a warning. Vivian simply vanished. She sold the condo Grant had bought with Colleen's money. With the proceeds returned to the estate and moved to another state for a fresh start. She sent Dorothy a single text 3 months after the verdict. "I am sorry. I know that doesn't mean much." Dorothy read it and left it there, a digital artifact reminding her that the woman who helped ruin her daughter's life also helped save her children. This quiet justice was supported by a new family circle. Dr. Nina Prescott became a frequent visitor, arriving every 2 weeks with milestone charts and homemade chicken soup. She checked on the babies, but she also stayed for coffee, talking with Dorothy about life, books, and the shared ache of missing a mother. They forged an unlikely friendship. A 61-year-old grandmother and a 40-year-old obstetrician, connected by the woman they both loved, and a promise they were both determined to keep. Jolene never missed a Sunday. She'd arrive at 9 in the morning with bagels from the Highland Avenue Bakery where she and Colleen used to meet. She'd bring 3 kinds of cream cheese, plain for Dorothy, everything for Fletch, and strawberry, because it had been Colleen's favorite. After breakfast, Jolene would read to the triplets, giving every character a unique voice, from a low, grumbly bear to a high, squeaky mouse. Teddy always let out the same bright, surprised laugh. "Your mother was much better at this," Jolene would tell the babies, Bridget chewing on a book corner in her lap. "She could make the bear sound like it was right here in the room. I'll keep practicing." Fletch, meanwhile, spent 3 weekends building a treehouse in the backyard. Driving down from Portland every Friday, he worked tirelessly with cedar planks and steel bolts. He painted it green, Colleen's second favorite color. The treehouse wasn't for the 6-month-old infants. It was for their future, for climbing and dreaming and whispering secrets when they were 5 and 7 and 10. A place to be closer to the sky and to their mother. He fixed a small, hand-carved plaque to the door. It read, in 2 simple words, "The Collie House." He showed it to Dorothy one Sunday afternoon. She looked up at the green structure bright against the oak branches and felt a true laugh bubble up. The kind she thought had been lost to grief forever. "She would have loved it," Dorothy said. "And she would have said, 'Your paint job is uneven,'" Fletch answered, and her laugh echoed, warm and real. It all began because in the evenings, after the babies were asleep, Colleen would sit in the rocking chair she had refinished herself, the one that still smelled of lemon oil, and she would make a choice. Positioned between the 3 cribs, she was not just a mother-to-be. She was a protector, laying the groundwork for a future she feared she wouldn't see, ensuring her children would be surrounded by love, not by a man's shadow. But the real weight of it all was waiting at home. In the quiet nursery, Dorothy sat in the old rocking chair, its gentle creak a steady pulse in the room. Before her were 3 cribs, each with a mobile of stars and moons spinning lazily under the soft glow of star-shaped nightlights. Margot was on her stomach, a stubborn trait Dorothy recognized instantly as pure Colleen. Bridget slept still as a little soldier, her eyes darting behind her lids, already dreaming. And Teddy, the quietest one, was curled on his side, his tiny fist pressed to his mouth. He was the most patient, always waiting his turn for a bottle or a cuddle. As Dorothy watched them, 3 tiny chests rising and falling, she understood why Colleen had done it all. This wasn't the tragedy people would whisper about: a young mother lost too soon, a cheating husband, a messy courtroom scandal. The real story was about a woman who saw the storm coming and built a life raft before her ship even began to sink. The story was about a mother who fought her final battle in total silence and won it from beyond the grave. She had gathered evidence, organized files, updated her will, and wrote letters, all while painting name plaques and singing to the 3 tiny heartbeats inside her. Standing up, Dorothy walked to the window and picked up a purple marker from the sill, the same one Colleen had used to draw hearts on the ultrasound photos. She uncapped it and drew a small, imperfect heart on the wall by each crib. Her hand wasn't as steady as a mother's, but the marks were there, permanent and full of intention. She would give them everything, every bottle, every lullaby, every bit of her love, because that's what Colleen had asked of her. She began to hum the simple, wordless tune her own mother had sung to her, the same one she had sung to Colleen, the one Colleen had then sung to her belly for 9 long months. A melody of love passed through 3 generations of women, echoing in the quiet house where 3 babies slept soundly. Dorothy Brennan, at 61 years old, exhausted and silver-haired, was fiercely, stubbornly alive. She had 3 mouths to feed, 3 futures to guard, 3 hearts that beat because her daughters had stopped. And now, at last, everyone would understand why. It had all started with a truth no one wanted to face: a loving mother who knew her time was short, and a husband who had already broken his vows. That's why she had prepared for the worst. That is a mother's love. It builds walls that outlast her and writes letters that speak after she is gone. If this story moved you, please hit the like button and leave a comment. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.